Good morning, everyone. We're continuing with the Ananda way of life. We're rounding the far turn, coming into the home stretch on this course. It's based on the guidelines of conduct for members of the Ananda Sevaka order. It's been a very deep, interesting, challenging series of programs, and we're not done yet because we're going to go through all the vows, which really will bring a final focus onto everything we've talked about. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Awaken us to your living presence, that we may be effortlessly guided along that pathway which leads to the greatest joy. We are your children. We long to live in harmony with your will. Give us courage and clarity, perseverance, patience, that we may hold true until realization comes. Om, peace. Amen. All right, my friends, we are now working with what Swami has described as the 4 basic principles that underlie the vows of Ananda. And they are simplicity, self-control, service, and cooperative obedience. Yesterday we talked about simplicity. Today we're going to talk about self-control, and here's what Swami says. Self-control means always to hold one's physical sense pleasures in rein and to strive to direct one's energy from the senses to soul consciousness rather than the reverse. And I'm going to read that again because it's quite a mouthful. Self-control means always to hold one's physical sense pleasures in rein and to strive to direct one's energy from the senses to soul consciousness rather than the reverse. Now bear in mind, what Swami's also balancing here is the traditional monastic vows are poverty, chastity, and obedience. So he's made them 4 by adding in service, which is in the most basic tradition is not usually spoken of, even though it can be fundamental to the order, but it's not always there. He calls us cooperative obedience instead of simply obedience, which we'll explain when we get there. Simplicity as opposed to poverty I talked about yesterday. Yesterday especially talking about simplicity. I was talking about my own essentially karmic inclination from past lives to be really at home with the idea of poverty, and simplicity actually being something I've had to learn. Oddly for me, poverty came easier, and it's an odd thing for me at least with money. Having no money is actually easier than having some money. Having unlimited money would be something else. Because unlimited money, you can just buy whatever you want. Having no money, you can't buy anything, so you don't think about it. It's having to make actual decisions according to Dharma. There's 2 stories about unlimited money that I enjoy. One was from Steve Jobs, and I know he was a complicated character, but when he was asked about all the money he had, he said, well, yeah, it's nice going into the bike shop and being able to buy whatever bike I want. That's how he put it, because he was never one for huge ostentation. But my favorite was from one of the band members of the Grateful Dead band. The Grateful Dead band, I know they're well known to everyone, but they were actually really part of my very brief pre-Ananda life, because I went to Stanford in 1965, and that's where the Grateful Dead got their start, right here in Palo Alto. And I actually, when they were really nobody in particular, they used to play on Friday nights, and I would go to wherever they were playing. I never followed them after that, but during that year I was part of that. So they always had a little part of my life. They ended up being terrifically famous and also got very wealthy from what they were doing, which was a total surprise to them because they were so counterculture, that isn't what they were doing. But one of the band members was asked, like, what's what's different about your life now that you're so wealthy, whereas before you were just a struggling musician, you know, sleeping in one room all together so they could play their music. He said, well, he said, before, when I was poor, when I would buy a bag of pistachios in the shell, you know how mostly they're cracked and you can open them up, but then every so often you get one that's just sealed shut. He said, when I was poor, I would just persevere till I got it open. He said, now I just throw those away. And I thought, yep, that about says it. I mean, that's how much his life had changed. Didn't mean that he didn't enjoy having the money, but nonetheless, it was a way of saying, it doesn't make me happy. Now I can waste pistachios. That's sort of what the difference between being wealthy and being poor. Okay, now we're going to self-control. Now, this self-control is very focused. Self-control means always to hold one's physical sense pleasures in rein. And that was what reminded me, oh yeah, this is instead of chastity, brahmacharya. I mean, one of the, you know, because we become such an incredibly sexualized society, where just everything is about sexuality, and people are profoundly confused and misguided because of the tremendous emphasis on sexuality, which is an important aspect of life, but not the defining aspect of life. And that's where the balance just gets turned over in a way that is highly unfortunate. But that's a whole different discussion. When people think nowadays of chastity, brahmacharya is the word that is the Sanskrit word. It's incomprehensible to many people. Even restraint is incomprehensible to many people. Restraint may be imposed upon a person by circumstance, but to actually deliberately choose it is not a very popular idea. However, as Swami himself said about the sort of licentious flow that has become our society, it's a good thing. Because before everything broke open, and it all started breaking open when I was a young adult, that's when this whole, I is one of the, you know, archetypal baby boomers, we just busted out there and turned everything upside down. We were breaking out of form and rules and fear. And we were coming into, as Swamiji put it very aptly, we were making experience the criteria of our values. And when you make your own experience the criteria of your values, if and then Swami added this as a condition, if you are honest about your experience, you will gradually discover all the ancient truths. Because the ancient truths are not put out there by an institution to control us. They are a direct observation of the way we are made and what ways of being, attitudes and actions and thoughts bring us happiness and which ones lead us to suffering. And licentiousness leads us to suffering, even though, as Master writes in one of his Whispers from Eternity, it's just so perfect. He says, the ways of virtue seem painful and unpleasant at the start, but turn out to be very helpful to us. I mean, Master says it poetically. And the ways of vice seem very pleasurable and very happiness producing at the beginning, but in the end lead us to great suffering, either because we dissipate our physical well-being and then result in debilitating disease, or we act on impulse and we betray our higher commitments and our higher values, and for those moments of lack of self-control, often we pay for them in chaos in our families or intense loneliness that begins to grow. Now, this is a very, very long discussion, so I'm not going to, well, we'll see how much I do on this. And I also noticed that he doesn't even say self-restraint, which was interesting to me. He phrases this, sometimes I do, as a wordsmith, I parse apart the actual word choices he made. Partly I do that because I know that Swami, as a writer, and this is how he trained me also as a writer, he paid attention to every word. And especially when he uses a slightly unexpected word, you know that he did it very much on purpose. So he uses the word self-control instead of self-restraint. Self-control, makes a line. This is a definite statement. I'll control these impulses. I won't merely restrain them, which means a little bit now and then, but restrain is not the same as control. Restrain is an attempt to control, but control is a much more emphatic word. And then he specifically, to hold one's physical sense pleasures in rein. Now, he's not just talking about sexuality, although in this context, this is a substitute for chastity, so the implication is we're talking about sexuality, at least to some extent. But when he just says physical sense pleasures, he's talking about all the ways in which the body compels us. I know Swamiji was, in one conversation we were having about the issue of sexuality and the confusion that existed among people of my generation and all the generations to follow. He said that the issue of a right understanding of sexuality among devotees, what to speak of society as a whole. But he said the difficulty is we never teach children about sexuality. We don't know how to talk about it from the more elevated yogic point of view. The reasons for self-restraint used to be that you would be damned by God and go to hell. And that's pretty powerful, but it's also barbaric. So it's just not the way to teach people. Not that this was about sexuality, but one of my friends, when he was 6 years old, he was going to Catholic school, and he was a bit of a rascally kid. And the nun told him that if he was a good boy, he would get a bigger house in heaven, is what he was told. And he was absolutely delighted with that pronouncement because he didn't care how big his house was in heaven. And if that was the only reason to be good, then he had license to do whatever he wanted from that point on. So it really did not succeed, but it epitomized just sort of ridiculous things that are said in an effort to control. Not really to enlighten or to guide, but just to control. The nun has, another of my friends who went to Catholic school, there were 50 children in the first grade class and one nun, and she had absolute control over that classroom, which is, I don't know, it's pretty scary in a certain way to have that many 6-year-olds and be able to hold them. I mean, like, what kind of force was she exerting? And hold them in a very, you sit in your desk and do your work kind of way. I'm digressing here, but one of my friends who was a primary school teacher who had a very loose way and a wonderful way of teaching, she said that she'd learned that a child can learn to read upside down just as easily as he can learn right side up. And sometimes better, because when he's upside down, he's expending all that energy in the right way. Anyway, but that was the context. So moving all the way back, now I did in fact lose the thread. Let me just see if I can find it for a minute. I went too far. I was holding the point here, but I lost it. I was talking about, just making experience your criteria so that here's what he said. So he's talking about physical sense pleasures. Oh, I know what it was. I was talking to Swamiji about just the difficulty, and Swami said because we don't educate children properly. I mean, and nowadays, I had this conversation with Swami 30 years ago in which everything was mild. Nowadays, everything is sexualized, and what children see on television and on advertisements and in the music. And people don't even, there's no innocence for childhood. We're just, children are dressed like little adults, little provocative little adults, especially the girls, all the way up, from tiny girls. And they dance to the same sensual music. It's all part of their reality. And they're not really taught what this energy is about, what overindulgence really does to your physical form, what it can do to your psyche, what it can do to your spirit. And I'm no prude. These are just yogic facts. And we need to be able to make informed choices. And Swamiji was saying, it will be several generations, and we have to start teaching children before puberty about sexuality, and then have creative, expansive, realistic ways of working with children. But we're swimming against the tide, to put it mildly. Okay, so by the time that we're all adults, we're products of this society. But what Swami was saying is that he says sexuality is a physical imperative. He said it's the same as being hungry, of needing to sleep, of needing to put on a sweater when the weather is cold. He said it's just your physical body impels you in all these different directions. Sexuality has other dimensions because the compulsion of it is so strong, and because it involves you with other people and gets your aura really mixed up with other people. And it can also create babies, and just all sorts of things begin to happen, can take over your really good judgment. But in the end, it's a physical imperative, and it needs to be separated from emotional needs. It needs to be separated from dharma. I mean, it just needs to be separated from a lot of other things, but still just understood what it is in a physical way. And what he says there, self-control, that one's physical sense pleasures in rein, R-E-I-N. In rein means, I did a little bit of horseback riding when I was a young teenager in Texas. And you have the reins of the horse. And if you have something in rein, you're still the one making the decision. If you're a little kid on a horse, the horse is a lot bigger than you, and the horse has the potential to take over, to put the bit in its teeth, as they say, because your control of the horse, if you're using the reins with the metal bit across the tongue of the horse, it's when you pull on that the horse gets the point. And it's, he learns. I never became very skilled, but there's all kinds of ways that you do it. But when the horse gets the bit in his teeth, he figures out that if he chomps down on that metal piece, you can't affect him. You can pull on those reins all you want, but he's got control of it, and then therefore it doesn't press his tongue. It doesn't make him uncomfortable. So if the horse gets the bit in his teeth, he can that's what it means. You just can run, and you can pull on those reins all you want, and then he's not going to pay any attention to you because he's outsmarted you. But when you have it in rein, you're able, even just no matter if you're just a small person compared to a horse 5 times your weight, you can still just direct it. So this is what Swami's saying here, that you're in charge. You're directing it. You always have those sense pleasures in rein. You do have to eat. You maybe have a sexual impulse in an appropriate context, where you can express that. He's not asking for celibacy. He's just asking that you know what you're doing, that you're making conscious choices in this matter and expressing yourself as appropriate. And Swami himself was not, we've never had a policy. Well, we've never had a policy at Ananda of interfering with people's private lives. It's just you can't set up an institutional police system. It's just, it leads almost immediately to hypocrisy. People just go underground. Because, as Swami also said, very wisely and kindly, you can't always control the feelings of the heart. So when marriages fall apart or inappropriate liaisons are formed or whatever it might be, Swami says you can't always control the feelings of the heart, and you can't. But we can make a collective decision that we're not just going to dive into this, what I would call a sinking ship, of complete licentiousness just because we can, because all institutional and social restraints have been taken down. It doesn't mean merely because the culture has no values that we should not have values. One of my young friends made a comment to me about something that was going on at his college at the time. He just said it rather casually. I don't even remember what the remark was, but afterwards I just had to think for a minute. I always have to think of how much of myself to express and how and to whom I should express it. And I said, you actually have no idea how morally reprehensible what you just described to me was. And than not wanting to leave it there, because that seemed like a bad place to leave it. I said, well, the really good news for your generation is that whatever values you develop will actually be discovered on your own. And actually, I think that is really good. I think it's better to be honestly chaotic than to be terrified to move. So that's what we're looking for. We're not looking for, oh, I'm so afraid if I do this, something will happen. No, it's that I understand that my greatest happiness lies in the direction of self-restraint and of conscious decision-making, rather than realizing later that the horse had the bit in its teeth and I didn't know what I was doing, and I never thought of the consequences. And to strive to direct one's energy from the senses to soul consciousness. And then he has that lovely phrase, rather than the reverse, which is to say that divine energy, I mean, we are divine beings. We are in physical bodies, and the physical imperatives really begin to direct our lives. And we can't always control the feelings of the heart. And every sense, pleasure, whatever it might be, and since we're mostly talking about sexuality, and Swamiji also, he commented about this. He said, I've never understand why people become so irate about sexual indiscretions. He said, yes, often they're unfortunate. He said, but there's so many worse things that people do. You know, deliberate treachery, deliberate cruelty to one another, you know, deliberate selfishness. He said, one, you can't always control the feelings of the heart. And two, you know, sexual energy is almost always motivated by a desire for comfort, a desire for intimacy, a desire to be close to people. And it generally comes out of a sense of loneliness, a sense, a need, you know, for that kind of, what would I say? Just that kind of experience where you can really be with another person in a unique way that creates a unique bond. And I'm at least giving the credit that we're moving a little bit above just animal instinct here, but let's give that credit, especially in the context of self-realization of anyone who's sincere on the path. We have these higher impulses in us, but as Swami said it again also, he said, you know, we can draw lots of energy from the divine, but it's just natural to also want to draw energy from one another. And when you're in a context of a spiritual family like Ananda, now I'm moving into the residential community aspect of it. When this man was deeply drawn to this woman, and he really hoped that there would be a marriage there, and he went to Swami to talk about it. Swami happened to know that that woman was just as deeply interested in a different man, and that was going to result in marriage. And Swami had to disappoint this man that it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't even that it wasn't suitable. It just wasn't going to happen. And he said, why then do I feel so close to her? It was a very good question, because he did. Swami's answer, we are a very old spiritual family. And as he said, if you look deeply into the eyes of anyone here, you will discover that you have a deep soul connection. So one of the things that happens in life in general, not just in the context of our community, but we can feel very connected to people, and we can even feel, you know, you're my wife, you're my husband, you're my life partner. You know, I can just tell you are. I can feel it. And so all of our desire to express that as sexual intimacy is perfectly understandable. And the way I think about it is this. You can have karma with a lot of people. So it's not a question that I have this tremendous karma with you, and it happens. You know, you meditate, you feel the connection, you even may feel the the power of your own super consciousness telling you to follow this. And all of those feelings can be true. And I like to respect this. Sometimes people are just using their imagination, but even if they're using their imagination, they're usually riffing off of something that's actually there, has been there. So that's karma. But the question is dharma. Karma is just energy that's in motion from the past. Dharma is that action which is going to lead to expanded consciousness. And even though, this may be a very familiar relationship, we may know just even before we start exactly, how known this will be in a very positive way. But all of that familiarity and even harmony with each other does not necessarily mean that in this incarnation it's the path for us to follow. Karma versus dharma. And what that does is that allows us to validate our feelings. And it allows us to not be afraid to be able to say, this is how I feel. Some people feel that if they admit how they feel, then what you do about those feelings is already also decided. And it's very helpful to realize that there are two different stages. One is to understand what's compelling me, and then the next thing is to say, what do I do about it? And self-control is also, what do I do about it? Not what do I feel, but where we exercise control. And we don't try to control our feelings in the sense of suppressing them or being embarrassed about them or being ashamed or guilty about them. No, they're just there. And as Swami was saying about not becoming too upset about this particular physical compulsion, it's almost always a positive impulse, a generosity of heart, a desire for expansion, a kindness, all kinds of these things. That's what I feel, but is it appropriate to express it? And it's just, is it appropriate to express it? Is this person committed to someone else? Is this really not going to support the entire direction of my life? There's lots of questions. We come into this world to do a lot of things, and this is where Swami said we want to direct our physical inclinations towards soul expansion, not just take, the energy that is given to us as life force and then just drain it out through physical expression. That's what our society just tells us to do. Yippee, we're here to enjoy ourselves. Let's just enjoy ourselves. There was one very popular spiritual teacher, spiritual in quotes, basically. He was very popular because he said, just do whatever you feel like doing, but call it spiritual. And naturally he had hundreds and hundreds of followers. He sort of faded away after a while, but no, that's not what we're here to do. We're here to genuinely fulfill our higher calling. And when our physical imperatives try to derail us from our higher calling, and Ananda is a householder community. We have couples and we have children, and so it's not like we're not trying to be celibate. We're not trying to just be monks and nuns, but we're trying to exercise sufficient restraint to keep the reins on our physical impulses sufficiently that we are able to make conscious decisions in favor of soul expansion. And this takes us all the way back to wherever I was, where it says, what do we do if we want to get married? Oh, we talk to those who have a little more experience than us, who can help us sort through whether we're being compelled by the highest that is within us or something else that is within us. And it may feel terribly right because it's a deep subconscious impulse. But just because it feels right, we have to ask also, on what level does it feel right? And this is where also this is a whole other subject, but it's where people get confused about inner guidance. something can feel very, very right because it's absolutely consistent with all my past karma, but it's not consistent with what God is calling me to do today. So self-control, to always hold the reins of our physical impulses so that we can use those compelling energies to lift us towards soul consciousness instead of pulling us away. God bless you, my friend.